It's the dead of winter, 1956, and America is at the height of the Cold War. A pilot named Major William Dotson, along with his 5 crewmates and passengers, are en route from Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, headed towards Harrisburg to pick up a load of aircraft parts from Olmsted Air Force Base. Because of the limited range of the crew's B-25 bomber, the aircraft had actually already made 2 refueling stops along the way and was now leaving Michigan for Pennsylvania, cruising at 7,000 feet just above a thick layer of clouds. The flight was relatively uneventful up until this point, apart from the occasional bump or patch of rough air caused by the winter weather. As the aircraft was about to leave Ohio, however, the crew noticed a sudden but significant drop in their fuel on board.
A call was made to the Pittsburgh air traffic controllers, who subsequently cleared the plane to divert to the greater Pittsburgh airport. The crew was advised that it was cloudy in Pittsburgh, no real surprise there, but visibility beneath the clouds was pretty clear. By the time they'd received this information, however, the crew's fuel gauges went from reading 120 gallons to reading 0, and the pilots had to switch over to using their emergency reserve tanks. Shortly thereafter, the aircraft broke through the clouds, and the pilots were able to see that they were headed directly towards the densest parts of Pittsburgh. Worried about running out of fuel over a densely populated area, the pilots began their turn towards greater Pittsburgh early and started heading south. As they made this turn, however, the reserve fuel continued to bleed from the aircraft, and the pilots decided that it would be wisest to make an immediate landing at Allegheny County Airport, which offered a shorter runway but was much closer to the plane's current position. Right as the crew pointed their plane in the direction of the county airport, the engines finally sputtered and they gave out as the fuel tanks ran dry. The captain made an immediate mayday call to Allegheny Tower, but knowing his plane wouldn't make it to the airport, he prepared to ditch it in the Monongahela River. The captain pulled his flaps to slow the plane down and began gliding his now powerless aircraft over the river, flying just a few feet over the deck of the Homestead Bridge. He bled off all the aircraft's speed and gently splashed the plane into the river just before arriving at the Glenwood Bridge. All 6 souls on board survived the landing, but sadly 2 died to hypothermia trying to swim through the icy Monongahela. All in all, it was an impressive feat of airmanship, and it was fortunate for all involved that more folks weren't injured, both on board the bomber and on the ground. The story of the B-25 ditching in the Mon is arguably Pittsburgh's most well-known aircraft story, but it was far from the deadliest or most devastating. That title belongs to 1994's US Air Flight 427, which was an early example of Boeing sweeping some shoddy engineering under the rug.
That 737 crash killed 132 after subjecting everyone on board to a horrifying nosedive, during which the passengers were subjected to forces over 4 times their own body weight. This bomber incident in 1956 was also far from the most famous accident to involve a B-25. That would have been a decade earlier, when a bomber crashed into the side of the Empire State Building. And even that story is just sort of a footnote in the history of planes and New York City skyscrapers. Despite that, this particular story of the B-25 landing on the Monongahela River has captured the hearts and minds of Pittsburghers ever since that cold January afternoon way back in 1956. There's even been reenactment flights over the river to celebrate the anniversary of the incident. So why is this flight so well remembered? Well, it's because the plane disappeared. It was last seen when river authorities had tied a rope to it, but the rope slipped from the aircraft and the B-25 sunk below the water, never to be seen again. Think about that for a minute. A 15-foot high aircraft with a wingspan of nearly 70 feet disappearing into a river 20 feet deep so quickly that not even the US military itself could find it after several days of search and rescue efforts. Unsurprisingly, the sudden disappearance of an entire military plane into one of our rivers lends itself to a number of conspiracy theories and urban legends around Pittsburgh. A story you might have heard at a local bar at the time might have gone something like this.
Yeah, I heard the bomber was flying this way from over Roswell where they had the UFO sightings. After they ditched it in the Mon, the Army closed off the whole river. They had hundreds of soldiers looking for the thing. I think they pulled it out somewhere by Duck Hollow. They cut it up in pieces, wings, tail, and shipped them off. I bet it was an atom bomb on board, but I also heard it could have been a spy or maybe a chemical weapon.
Other versions of the story would claim that it was aliens, mustard gas, or mafia money that were being held on the bomber. All of these stories had something in common, however, the idea that the plane was removed from the river, disassembled, and then distributed to military bases across the country. These theories are further supported by local eyewitness testimonies, which claim to have seen parts of the plane being carried out of the water in the overnight hours in the days following the accident. In the 1970s, a local man called into a KDKA radio show claiming to be a cargo truck driver who had been contracted by the CIA to remove the wreckage from the crash site and transport it to a missile silo just outside of town. Theorists who believe in the government cover-up like to point to the heavily redacted nature of the report on the crash by the Air Force. But the military insists that redacting sensitive information is a normal practice of the US Air Force. And I can personally attest that that is absolutely true. The US government is no stranger to redacting information from the public record. Either way, many Pittsburghers are convinced that the government did have something to do with the plane's disappearance. There's others that are convinced the aircraft is definitely still down there just waiting to be found. This is the belief of Captain Jack Ross, a well-respected boat pilot and riverman from Monroeville, who quite literally wrote the book on boating in Pittsburgh. And he wrote to the Post-Gazette in 1994 arguing this very idea, saying that he found it odd that none of the supposed eyewitnesses of the military cover-up were the hundreds and hundreds of longshoremen, captains, rivermen, and boat pilots who were conducting their normal operations along the river. Captain Ross asserts that it would be impossible for the government to conduct such a covert removal of the plane without hundreds of river workers being direct witnesses to that operation.
This would be especially true if the plane was extracted from somewhere near Duck Hollow, and I'd also like to point out Duck Hollow is actually upstream from the place where the plane crashed, so that rules that theory out. Captain Ross also alleges that many laymen underestimate just how hard it is to find something sunken in the rivers, especially a river with a current and as much muck and sediment and silt that gets carried through it as the Monongahela.
Full-size barges have sunk and never been found in these rivers,
He says,
why the entire plane would be recovered is a mystery in and of itself. The government had acres and acres of B-25s for sale in New Mexico. If there was something valuable on board, it would have made more sense to have a diver recover that item rather than salvage the whole aircraft.
And Captain Ross was absolutely right. The B-25 was already a super outdated aircraft in 1956. It wouldn't have been worth the government's time or resources to salvage the parts. And if there was in fact some type of important payload or cargo on that plane,
The Army would simply just extract that item and leave the wreckage alone. There's no reason for them to touch it.
Captain Ross alleges that the plane likely stayed afloat for a couple of minutes, but as it took on enough water to sink, it settled itself into a depression at the bottom of the river. And then as the first couple of loaded barges made their way up and down the Mon as they normally do, it's believed that the wakes of these barges and boats acted to push the B-25 further and deeper into the silt, sand, and clay at the bottom of the river. By the time the federal authorities arrived, there would have been no parts of the plane sticking up above the sand for them to even find. And with technologies like sonar detection still in their infancy at the time,
It just wasn't worth the efforts of search and rescue crews to go and dig up a World War II aircraft in an era of missiles and jets.
so as the years and months went on, it is believed that the plane dug itself further and further underneath the river bottom, and with decades of erosion due to the polluted waters and industrial runoff in the Mon, many experts believe that all of the aluminum components in the plane, like the main skin around the fuselage, have completely dissolved, leaving only things like the engines and the landing gear and some of the more structural components of the plane that are made from other things like steel or titanium. Captain Ross's idea of what happened to the bomber is pretty close to the official story of the US Air Force, who claim the plane was likely swept up by the Monongahela current before digging itself into a watery grave buried beneath all the dirt and muck of the Monongahela. Because of deteriorating weather conditions after the crash, they just gave up and stopped looking. And this official story of the US Air Force is also the belief of the historians at the Heinz History Center. In the 90s, they teamed up with a group of interested locals called the B-25 Recovery Group to try to search the crash site with a sonar detector and see if they could come up with anything. After a lot of hard work from all those involved, though, no signs of the plane or its components were ever recovered or located.
That's not to say they didn't find anything down there. The problem was they found too many sunken metal objects to really be able to find an actual plane.
And that brings us to today, with many historians still believing the official story, but with numerous rumors, theories, and urban legends circulating around Pittsburgh as to the true nature of those events back in 1956. Both the official narrative and the theories of cover-up lack substantial evidence to back their claims, so no one can definitively say for sure. It's possible that the Air Force omitted some details about the nature of the recovery, or some information about some kind of sensitive cargo on board, but it's pretty unlikely that the government felt the need to scrap or salvage the aircraft.
It is possible that there was some special payload on board, and if that's the case, maybe they went and retrieved it, but that probably would have been about it.
It is equally possible, however, that the plane did indeed dig itself scores of feet below the riverbed and just remains there to this day. What do you think happened to the ghost bomber? Is it lurking at the bottom of the river, or was there something more nefarious involved? Let us know in the comments down below. And be sure to stay tuned for future videos, where we explore the historic, the mysterious, and the fascinating stories in and around Pittsburgh.